Thinking back to our whole research statistical cycle, once we have the actual research question posed, that's when we need to determine what our observational units are going to be and what our variables are going to be, which is what I've asked you to do in that first discussion board for week 2. So I guess it's your second discussion board, but your discussion board for week 2. And that's essentially what I'm having us do as well for this exercise 1.2.1. So here we're looking at telephone companies trying to determine if a cell phone is being used by someone other than the owner. So we're sort of asked, what information or variables should we be collecting in order to develop a profile so that we can know if something unusual is happening with a phone? So I'd like you to take a moment. This is the first time I'm going to say this in this course. Pause. Try this on your own. Once you've come up with a couple, start the video again. So hopefully you paused, you didn't cheat, and you're coming back with a couple of things written down. So there's no right or wrong answers to this. I'm just going to write down some of the examples that my students have come up with in the past when we've done this in class. So a lot of students have things related to the actual calls themselves. This could be the numbers dialed, where the calls are coming from, or who they're outgoing to. If I start calling new numbers, it's probably not me anymore. Duration is obviously important. As someone who never talks on the phone unless it's absolutely necessary, if all of a sudden I'm spending hours on the phone, that is definitely suspicious. And especially if I start making international calls, right? That would be a very suspicious thing as well. So what numbers I typically call, how long I normally spend on the phone each day or for each call, and then how many international calls I'm making, which is 0. But these are the things that you might want to collect, right? There's usually some students come up with examples about data usage. So data usage by itself, how many gigabytes or however much data you use per day might be important. Yeah, typical daily usage. You could also start looking at app usage or downloads, sort of in that same vein. That might be important. You could start looking at texts, right? If there's something related to text stuff, what numbers am I texting? How many of them? We could also look at password attempts, especially if we have like a lock screen attempts, that type of a deal. Like I said, there's no right or wrong answers to this, and there's a huge amount of data that you can imagine. Almost all of this your cell phone company has anyways, because they're billing you on your calls, your data usage, and your texting. So you can bet they have all this information. And then obviously GPS would be a big deal. If all of a sudden your phone is in Mexico, then that might not be you using it anymore. So this is all just, there's no right or wrong. You could have your own examples here. Don't worry too much if they're different from mine or you don't write all of this down. But this is that start of statistical thinking that is so important. Now, once we have our variables, they can fall into one of two categories. And this is something I do test on. Besides just what are my observational units, what are my variables. This previous exercise, by the way, is a question I've done on tests. You'll see it on the homework. I think I asked you to figure out what are some variables you might want to collect to figure out who's going to tip more at a restaurant if you were a server. I usually try to do something that we all have experience with, like we've all been to a restaurant before, we all own a cell phone. So it's not going to require that you have a whole lot of knowledge of whatever we're talking about. It's more, can you do a little bit of statistical thinking in terms of what variables would be interesting in this particular situation. Now, types of variables, we have two big types, categorical and quantitative. Categorical splits our data up into categories, whereas quantitative is some sort of measurement that has a numeric value. So you'll also sometimes see quantitative variable called numeric. And you'll sometimes see categorical data called qualitative because it technically describes a quality of our observation. So those are the two ones that we're going to be looking at. If we kind of look back at what we were talking about here, a lot of these things like quantity would be a good, how many texts I send per day would be a nice numeric, right? But we have this big warning here that not all numeric data is quantitative. And hopefully this example right here, the phone numbers are a really good example of numeric data that is not quantitative. Sorry, I hate this giant fat pen. I have to stop it. Add that. So anyways, now I should have a tiny, tiny red pen. So our phone number is a good example of something. It is 10 digits long, right? But my phone number, if you change it by one, let's just write down my office phone number, which you guys could call and leave me messages on, which I will never listen to. It's blinking at me now. If you take this and you add one to it, that one doesn't have any meaning, right? All you're doing is calling someone else's phone now. So it's just a category of this is the phone number that you can reach me at. There are other examples, so I'd like you to come up with some, and maybe we will talk about this in class when we come in week 2. I'll ask if we have some more examples for things that are numeric but not actually quantitative. So maybe take a moment, pause, see if you can come up with something other than phone numbers to throw in there.